It is 10 o'clock on Thursday, and here is BirchTalk. I warmly welcome all our listeners to the very BirchTalk of UBirch. We also have a slide with the title, actually, which could be displayed now. And today's BirchTalk is about the topic of green energy, location-based matters, and how the EU is now forcing companies to rethink the issue of green electricity. I have two speakers with me, whom I would like to warmly welcome. One is Thorsten Dahmen, Senior Innovation Manager at E.ON Group Innovation GmbH. And then, of course, for UBirch, we have Stefan Nohler, our CEO. At the end, we will have a Q&A session, and you can write questions in the comments at any time during the topic. So that means if you think of anything you want to know or ask, we always keep one eye on that and can perhaps answer it right away. In any case, we will address it at the end. Yes, so our topic today, as I have already mentioned, is location-based matters. How the EU is forcing companies to rethink green electricity. Many companies have long claimed that they use green electricity, and they also assert that they can simply write a zero when it comes to emissions in their energy consumption. And so honestly, I believe it hardly surprises anyone when one slowly realizes that it isn't quite true. Somehow there is still smoke coming from the power plants, even though everyone seems to be using green electricity. And now the EU has also made a move with the CSRD Directive. There is now a reporting obligation for ESG data, and among other things, companies must report their emissions. And now it is clearly no longer possible to simply write a zero just because one uses so-called green electricity. We want to talk today about why this is the case and what it specifically means for companies, as well as what can be expected from energy providers in this context and how the market will continue to change. And regarding the topic of 2021, we are very pleased. I am very pleased that we were able to bring in an absolute pop expert for this story. Thorsten Dahmen is with us. He has over 20 years of professional experience in the energy sector. He has been a senior innovation manager in industry innovation at E.ON Group Innovation GmbH for 4 years, where he leads pioneering projects in the fields of industry automation and electrification. His company, which is E.ON Group Innovation GmbH, reports directly to the strategy unit of the E.ON Group. And with that, he is, of course, significantly responsible as a pace setter for the strategic innovations within the company. And how could it be any different? E.ON is currently preparing the response of the largest German energy provider to the 2021 issue I just mentioned. This is referred to as location-based reporting, which is now required. But before we get into that, we would like to learn a bit about you and your job, Thorsten, so we can get to know you better. Please tell us how one actually becomes a senior innovation manager and what innovations you have been able to work on in that job.
Yes, first of all, I am very happy to be here. And yes, as an innovation manager, I am essentially always called upon when it comes to generating or creating new product offerings or business models for our core business, or modifying existing ones so that we as an energy provider can offer even better options to our customers. And yes, support them on their personal journey towards the energy transition. I can't really say exactly how one becomes an innovation manager or senior innovation manager or whatever the title may be. It was probably a perfect match between my motivation to change things and to want to look at and consider them from different perspectives, and the need for companies to respond to the constant and ever accelerating changes and events in the business field. In other words, I would really like to do something or make a change, and the company needs to be able to respond innovatively to such circumstances. I think that has somehow correlated perfectly in terms of timing and requirements, and that's how I grew into it.
Can you illustrate that a bit? So We will soon talk about location-based services and how you as an energy provider are responding to that. But you've been in this for a few years now, and this is certainly not your first topic. Do you have any exciting innovation from the last few years that went through your hands, where you were involved?
Yes, one can certainly call the product. That is also actively operated intelligent heating control.
That was too fast. Intelligent
heating control.
Heating control, okay.
Exactly. With that, one can, across manufacturers, for example, optimize gas heating or generally fossil fuel operated heating systems to save up to 30% on energy costs and corresponding CO emissions, all while not having to sacrifice comfort, meaning warmth. This means that it is a very, very good solution, a very cost-effective solution for existing heating systems in multifamily homes and so on. There are also very interesting applications in terms of district heating supply. Yes, and furthermore, we are also working on many topics and exciting use cases around decentralized technologies in combination with confidential compute. The use cases benefit greatly from these properties in terms of data protection and cybersecurity, which is also a major issue for companies. And yes, I am very curious about what we will have to report in the near future.
Well, that sounds exciting. It's quite broad, as you can tell. It covers heating, cybersecurity, everything is included. I actually have a personal question now. You just talked about the energy transition. Now, the energy transition is a topic that concerns us all and is important for society. Clearly, we need to take action against climate change, and energy consumption plays a central role. How does that feel? I've been curious about that for a long time. When you work for an energy provider, you automatically feel somewhat guilty. We are the ones who might potentially be producing energy here in a dirty way. What is your feeling about it? Do you feel pressured, or what does it do to you?
No, I would say the exact opposite. So, absolutely no bad feelings regarding this. On the contrary, I see it as a great challenge. And I am proud to be able to work on and contribute to this challenge for our society and also for companies to help shape it. Essentially, the energy transition is really my favorite topic, even though the reason and trigger for it are rather on the negative side. But if you are interested in solving complex and exciting, challenging problems and shaping them in a way that is truly economically and socially viable, then you are exactly in the right place with the energy provider in the energy industry, in the energy sector.
Okay. So that motivates you and drives you, Usant. That's cool. And it's of course nice to hear that the energy providers are actively thinking in the same direction, essentially as we as a society need to move. It's going to be exciting to dive right into the topic. Before that, I would like to bring my second conversation partner on board. As is customary in the BirchTalk, we naturally have a representative from the host with us. Here with us is Stefan Noller, founder and CEO of uBirch. Hello, Stefan.
Hello, everyone.
And uBridge also has an innovation up its sleeve, one could say. We are also working on innovations at Hubert with the ESG Data Exchange Network. Hubert has created the first open platform for publishing and exchanging emissions data. We will get to that shortly. And of course, how it ideally fits with what E.ON Group Innovation GmbH is currently preparing as an innovation for 2021. But since we are currently discussing the energy transition as a topic, I wanted to ask you about it, as you recently reported on your personal blog, and I believe also on LinkedIn, that you have initiated the energy transition at your home. Could you briefly share how that came about and what has happened?
Sure, gladly. So that winter was, so to speak, the first Putin-Ukraine winter, you could say, not just for fun, but suddenly there was a request from the federal government to try to reduce your gas consumption. And we live here in a semi-detached house and have our own gas heating in the basement and so on. So a lot is within reach. And I thought to myself, okay, then take a look. At first, one naturally thinks, what can you really change? Well, maybe just the temperature a bit. We actually bought wool blankets and lowered the temperature a bit. I have teenagers at home, so it's not exactly trivial. But then I was also a bit inspired by what Thorsten did with his intelligent heating control. And I thought, no, come on, I want to understand it better. And we must say that our setup includes solar thermal energy on the roof. So we have modules that can heat the water directly and are connected to the heating system. And from this, it follows that Thorsten will also address much larger goals, so to speak, regarding coupling, control requirements, because a crucial question is how intelligently the systems are interconnected. But it also started with such trivial things that I realized our heating was programmed to maintain very hot water, almost 60 degrees, from 5 in the morning until 11 at night, continuously. And then I thought to myself, why is it so hot, and so on? And then I realized that the thermal disinfection was simply disabled in the heating system 2001, which is necessary to suppress Legionella and so on. And one thing that I believe Thorsten also mentioned regarding the intelligent heating controller, which is also identified as a pattern, is that the heating industry has simply set everything for maximum comfort and no hassle. So ideally, there should always be warm water, preferably a bit hotter, and so on. And then I essentially did two things, which can be read in more detail. One aspect is simply the use of 2021 with the temperature adjusted for heating, meaning it is warmed up later, warmed less, and regulated down during the day. In the meantime, my teenage daughters hate that there is no hot water during the day on weekdays, but you have to press the button in the basement to heat it up. What I found most fascinating was the connection with solar thermal energy, namely that you have to adjust the heating accordingly. It's actually quite simple. When does the sun rise? From then on, I can expect something from the thermal system, and ideally, I will only require hotter water at that point. So I need to synchronize the demand time as much as possible with the sun, and then I have to allow the sun to heat the water very hot in the boiler. This was also regulated for comfort reasons, safety reasons, and so on. And now our system works in such a way that when the sun shines, the water gets very hot during the day. So you really have to be careful. As a result, it can maintain the temperature overnight for long enough that it is warm enough in the morning for a shower. And very often the gas heating doesn't even turn on anymore. And the crazy thing is, months later, the gas bill came and we had saved 40% on gas. And I thought to myself, damn. So that was, of course, a really small success experience and so on. But I have thought, and this is also Thorsten's topic with Dynamic Flex, about how much we waste completely unnecessarily. Well, my daughters might assess it a bit differently, but actually, we hardly have any loss of comfort. And saving 40% on gas is incredibly easy because it's set up in such a way that comfort doesn't matter. And I believe that's how we have built many of our systems. This is basically from the knowledge of the early years of the last millennium. The fundamental attitude towards how to approach this is not at all focused on energy saving. And the gain that can be achieved there, I found enormous.
So I believe that this is the key message for now. One can achieve something with small steps. I think this applies not only to individuals, but also to companies. And what you are saying, I also consider to be very important, namely the topic of 2001. One has to step a bit out of the comfort zone. It's not that bad, but we usually have everything set to default as simply and comfortably as possible. I think this also applies to the idea that energy just comes from the socket. Electricity is always available. And people are not used to thinking about when they need it or when it would be cheaper to turn on the large consumer. It's a new aspect. I can also share something about myself. Since I installed the photovoltaic system on my roof, the dishwasher no longer runs in the evening, but at noon instead. These are small things, but they make a difference every day. And that actually shows that there isn't much that needs to be changed. One needs to become more aware of what one is doing. And I believe that this is somewhat of a lead-in to today's topic. As private customers, we know how it is when looking up electricity tariffs. They bombard you with green electricity, eco-electricity, natural electricity, and everything else. It hardly gets any greener. Most people don't really want to know the detailed differences. It just always says 100% renewable. Sounds great. Good conscience, I did great. And that's how companies often do it these days. They buy green electricity, and then, of course, they just put a zero on it. We have zero emissions. All our products are produced in a climate neutral manner, or the company's balance sheet is completely neutral, because all our electricity, and we consume a lot of it, is generated without any emissions. But actually, that can't really be true, especially in energy-intensive production facilities. It is hardly imaginable that this can really happen without emissions. And now the EU has also intervened with the CSRD Directive, which requires companies of a certain size to make their emissions transparent. And on top of that, it was said that you cannot simply write a zero if your energy provider claims that it is a tariff that is emissions neutral. Rather, you must report in two different ways. One must therefore report energy in two ways, as it is commonly said, once market-based and once location-based. And most people don't understand that at first, as we also notice with Hubert. Therefore, I think it needs to be briefly explained for our listeners. Stefan, can you briefly describe the difference and especially explain why both need to be reported now?
Absolutely, I'd love to. And we have a wonderfully nerdy slide for that. I really like it. Maybe just to briefly repeat what you just said, because it can't be said often enough, as most people, even CSRD experts and so on, don't know that. In fact, both location-based and market-based reporting are now mandatory. You can already see that we might be able to provide a link in the show notes. There are initial sustainability reports from large companies where this has already happened. Well, that shows, and these are usually unpleasant numbers, which is why no company would do this voluntarily. So we have an example of a very large insurance company where the total emissions have increased by 20% because they now have to report energy based on location. It is painful, but it makes sense for exactly the reasons you mentioned, Matthias, because it somehow lacks credibility. I live here in Cologne. And when you climb up to the cathedral and look towards the city outskirts, you can see 3 huge power plants. These are 3 of the top 10 CO emitters in Europe. And they all produce electricity. And then you naturally wonder, but I'm sure that in every sustainability report of some company based in Cologne, you can look in and find something in scope 2 regarding zero emissions and not much more.
If everyone has a green electricity tariff, the power plants would essentially have to shut down.
Exactly. And now it is also the case that, of course, this is not fraud or anything like that. Everything is fine and in compliance. This simply has to do with the fact that on the left side, the right side of the picture, companies are allowed to purchase origin certificates quite regularly. For example, there are hydropower plants in Norway that have an endless supply because they undoubtedly produce green electricity in abundance and can then sell these certificates to others for a relatively small amount of money. For the kWh produced wherever, I buy a certificate and then I am allowed to sell it as market-based green electricity. It's completely fine. Not bad at all. It has a regulatory effect, and the mechanism isn't entirely to be criticized, but it is a bit. It's a market mechanism. And as can be seen from this example on the outskirts of Cologne, it can be misleading. And perhaps one more very current example, if you look at the whole AI discussion. It is now being said that the transition from the current AI models to the next generations may fail due to the enormous energy consumption. So data centers are being built right next to power plants because they require incredible amounts of electricity. That's simply not the case. If we start saying that, by the way, everything has zero emissions, we don't need to worry at all. That's just misleading us. It's not wise. And that's why the EU has said location-based, please refer to the left side of the image as the second number. And that's actually quite simple. It's what comes out of the socket. So if my mix, which I receive, actually includes, I don't know, lignite, nuclear power, or whatever, then that is part of the mix and I have to report it. And if it is not 100% renewable energy, then it cannot be zero.
So maybe you can summarize it like this. You might have paid for a certificate for green electricity in Norway, but that electricity is in Norway and not with you in Cologne in 2001. And in Cologne, the electricity you get from the socket, unfortunately, comes from that coal power plant. And that's why market-based is okay, a zero possibly, because it is compensated, but location-based, meaning at the place where you take it from the grid, it is unfortunately still associated with emissions. And this needs to be made transparent again.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that the EU doesn't just want to cause some kind of pain. It wants people to think more about it and to source electricity from the socket in a smarter way. You mentioned that you actually gave an example yourself, Matthias, with your dishwasher. You kind of know that, so to speak, location-based because you are feeding in yourself. Your electricity mix is greener in the afternoon than in the evening. So you turn on the machine at noon. This is, so to speak, Thorsten, don't hit me, but roughly what the EU wants. It's not you, but rather large energy-consuming companies that need to think about this and say, okay, how can I change my actual consumption? How can I, for example, or I want to make a power purchase agreement with a wind farm next door, which will actually provide me with electricity and has a real off-take guarantee from me, rather than some hydropower plant in Norway that has no idea it's connected to me.
Maybe we should directly pose this question to Thorsten. Thorsten, you have certainly been the most directly aware of how your corporate clients, especially the large consumers, are now dealing with this. How have they reacted now? What kind of requirements are they placing on you as energy providers? What do they have planned now?
First, let's turn the microphone back on. Yes, indeed. Some were caught off guard, thinking they had essentially dealt with the emissions issue by purchasing green electricity. But I would say that fundamentally, most have already anticipated this and are prepared for how it is expected to unfold. Basically, the reaction is that it is a new customer demand, to which we respond with appropriate development, offerings, and innovation.
Sorry, what is the need? What do they want now? What are they asking for now? Now they are saying, I have to report based on location. Help, can't you also get rid of the emissions, or what do they want from you?
This is, of course, diverse. So fundamentally, it all starts with driving local decarbonization, meaning the establishment of PV systems that operate locally, of course, the PPAs, but also the big question of how I can optimize my process, that is, my business process, in such a way that I can effectively organize my needs, either cost-driven or by reducing CO2 emissions.
So they ask you how they can optimize their consumption themselves. I assume that for this, they need more transparency, or when are, which emissions involved? Is it perhaps different in the morning than at noon, or is it heading in the direction of 2001?
Exactly. Transparency is the first step. There are then various approaches. Many companies are investing on their own, taking the initiative, and investing in appropriate energy management systems to achieve transparency. However, this often leads to these transparency creating systems only creating transparency. They essentially just point out the issues. There you have a pain point. However, we are often not in a position to optimize this in a larger context and restructure the systems and processes in such a way that it truly becomes a lever and is implemented accordingly. And that's where we come in to orchestrate, summarize, and synchronize everything at a higher level with market needs and requirements in general.
Okay, now let me follow up briefly. You just mentioned cost optimization. I believe that's nothing new. Logically, especially when I consume a lot of electricity, I need to ensure that I optimize the costs as a company. It's also clear that if I can reduce electricity consumption, I will have to spend less on electricity. As a company, it is probably already the case that they utilize dynamic tariffs and can use better, cheaper electricity at certain times. What I want to get at now is that I have a second parameter to optimize. Once I had cost optimization and now suddenly emissions optimization comes into play, it could soon mean costs in some way if the carbon price goes up. Is this a contradiction, or can they be combined? I mean, Is electricity possibly expensive but emission-free, or the other way around? Or what does that look like?
That's a very good question. Essentially, these are separate matters. One is about the carbon footprint of the electricity that I am currently consuming locally. The other thing is, of course, what are the prices on the stock market? For example, when companies buy directly on the spot market. Fortunately, there is a very strong temporal correlation between favorable energy prices, meaning a high energy supply, especially during times when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing strongly, and similar conditions, their energy prices generally tend to go down very often. And as one can already hear, solar energy and wind energy are typically associated with very low CO emissions, which consequently helps to improve the energy mix towards CO neutrality. And I can take advantage of this when I know or can foresee it in advance. If I can do that, I can certainly align my processes accordingly in advance to operate my business in a cost-optimized and co-optimized manner during those times.
Okay, so first of all, we understand, and fortunately, at least that's the case, the things do not necessarily contradict each other. This means that one can assume that price and emissions can be optimized together. Nevertheless, one now has to somehow keep both in mind suddenly. But I believe you have something prepared. You wouldn't be a senior manager for innovations if you didn't have some innovation up your sleeve at E.ON Group Innovation GmbH, which I think you can report on now, since it is already being offered. Tell me, what have you come up with and how can you better support companies now?
Yes, exactly. Here comes a slide which I will address shortly. In principle, companies should start managing their energy consumption more consciously and purposefully, as most of them have already begun to do. As an energy provider, it is important for us to support companies in this challenge and to offer suitable tools for that purpose. For example, there is the e-Optimum solution, which particularly focuses on commercial buildings and helps to optimize energy consumption there. However, the big problem is when all major consumers, large companies, etc., start doing this on a large scale. Starting to shift their loads dynamically will make the whole situation and the electricity demand very difficult to plan predictably. This leads us as energy providers to be pushed into a reactive position. And as is generally known, when one has to react spontaneously, for example, ensuring grid stability, keeping demand and supply in balance, is always less effective than being able to drive smoothly and steadily on a straight road without bumps. And that is why it is in our mutual interest to work towards this good planning capability and to empower customers to align their processes according to when it will be green, when it will be cheaper, etc. At the same time, we need to synchronize with our purchasing processes, market conditions, and grid management conditions. And this can only be achieved hand in hand. And for that, Dynamic Flex, our Dynamic Flex offering, is responsible. Or rather, that is what we provide there. If we could display the graphic again, I know it seems very complex at first glance, and it is, but fundamentally, at its core, it is about bringing together as many different energy consumers with corresponding flexibility potential as possible, merging them in the center or middle of the image to create a pool, optimizing this pool of flexibilities and demands, and then supplying it to the energy markets accordingly. Of course, we see the challenge. There are many players, a wide variety of providers of energy management systems, 2001. Some are better, while others are more reactive and have fewer optimization capabilities implemented at their core. And when one really needs to translate an overarching optimization solution, one must ensure that they can communicate with as many people as possible and can compensate for or fill any potential gaps. And that is exactly what Dynamic Flex is internally there for, to enable a truly targeted optimization, regardless of what is available at the customers. Of course, when we are dealing with customers or clients who have nothing in place yet, the first step would be to implement a local optimization tailored to the customer's needs, and then pass it on to the higher authority so that they can also be included in this pool. The next purpose that we see is, on one hand, I need to provide the opportunity to create transparency about when it will be the greenest. This means that we also provide the opportunity and transparency to accurately determine postal codes showing what the carbon footprint of the consumed electricity will be within a 15-minute window. So it's essentially a preview, as well as subsequently for reporting purposes, of how it really was. Exactly, that is one aspect. And the next thing, of course, is that when I have such a close integration between production, corresponding systems, and data, I should not use this solely for one purpose. Once you have this level of communication, it is advantageous to build additional services on top of it, to make it even more attractive, or rather, even more efficient. And this is exactly where the solution from Ubit comes in, where we have really implemented this fully automated CSRD reporting. Since we essentially have to collect or provide the necessary data anyway, it is obviously a win-win situation that this can be directly handed over, processed as required, and then passed on to my clients or included in the official reporting, such as when the co-print of product XY was at a certain time.
Thorsten, first of all, thank you very much. That sounds really exciting. Since there was a lot to cover, I will actually try to summarize a few aspects in my own words, and please jump in if I explain anything incorrectly. So first of all, I understand that it's about looking ahead. In other words, you are saying that as energy providers, you do not want to be surprised by someone suddenly turning their large consumer on or off. This means one could imagine that a company realizes that at certain times it is cheaper. So now we switch on. But you say that when this happens, we as energy providers have a problem because we did not expect this in the short term. We now have to buy additional energy and then it becomes expensive. So this is difficult for you. You want to create incentives for planning ahead.
Right. Exactly. So it's not just driven by the market and prices, but also clearly by grid stability issues. Yes, that means if a consumer does this now, okay, it's compensated. If it's 10, the problem is 4 weeks. Exactly.
Okay, so stability. And then I understood that you need to ideally know in advance, which means that companies must start planning their consumption ahead of time. That is, to consider or decide when they will turn on their consumers. And this can be communicated and coordinated with you through Dynamic Flex. And in this way, both parties essentially benefit from it. That means you have an advantage as an energy provider because you can plan, and the company presumably gets these advantages back monetarily. Can one imagine it that way? Is this somewhat like Dynamic Flag?
Yes, quite roughly. This means that we essentially share our insights into market developments, price trends, and other matters in advance, communicating this to the customers with their energy management system. If they do not have one, we are happy to optimize for them, taking that into account. We then look at which types of systems or processes the specific customer is currently implementing at their location. and we consider how we can adjust certain elements to perfectly fit their profile. We receive feedback such as, here is what my load curve looks like for tomorrow, for the next week, or however it may be. What we can then take into account in purchasing processes and other capacity planning. However, since this is not a one-time loop, but a continuous loop, it means that renewable energies are unfortunately also more volatile than traditional lignite or hard coal power plants, which means we can also respond to spontaneous events. This means that the energy management, the management of the customer, can inform us that, unfortunately, the sun is not shining from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. as expected, and now it is already 2 p.m. and it is still not shining. This allows us to react spontaneously to this load shifting and also to respond significantly faster. The same applies to production downtimes and other events that usually happen suddenly and catch us completely by surprise. We receive this information in a much more structured, faster, and detailed manner, which allows us to make meaningful use of it. We can also send back corrected plans, which can lead to new optimizations on site. It is truly a continuous give and take to really try to find the optimum between the market world, grid stability, and consumer needs.
Okay, so I understand that ultimately it's about exchanging data and also planning in advance. This means you provide a hint about how the price development in the market will look tomorrow or the day after, and you want to know from the customer how their electricity demand will fit into that so that you can actually purchase and prepare accordingly. It seems so simple to me. Tell me, Dynamic Flex, is that actually an offer that everyone can get now, or are you still testing it, or how far along are you with it?
Currently, it is in testing or pilot operation with a few customers. And we are planning an iterative market launch starting at the end of 2025. This is a large, complex topic. We will gradually make it available to the market in a modular way.
And now, one more question. We are, of course, imagining large manufacturing companies that might have a certain flexibility in deciding when to start their energy-intensive processes.
However, this does not apply to everyone, as smaller companies that are not really in a position to change their energy consumption may find it makes sense for them. Or is this something only for the very large companies? We are definitely talking about something that is very important for the good German middle class. But if I have a small bakery or other similar businesses, then Dynamic Flex is likely too ambitious. And the requirements are quite different from what I could potentially optimize. But in the context of the emergence of dynamic tariffs, there will also be corresponding offers that I can take advantage of. They are, of course, smaller in scale and also tailored to the respective application case.
Okay, but since you just mentioned the small business, that means, Stefan, we might have to adjust to the fact that fresh bread won't be available in the morning anymore, but only in the afternoon, because the baker suddenly turns on the oven at noon when electricity is cheaper. That could also happen, right?
Yes, I also found it exciting, Thorsten. I believe one can say that one of the first customers is, for example, a large cold storage facility. And because one always thinks that way, I find Becker is a bit like a miss. Of course, he can also say, I will turn on my oven 10 minutes later. That can already help stabilize the grid, especially if there is shading at that moment or something like that. But I find cool storage really exciting because when you think about it, it's essentially a large battery, energetically speaking. When there's a lot of electricity available, sometimes there are even excess capacities that energy providers are happy to get rid of. So it simply cools down by another 5 degrees and can then say 2 hours later, it's a bit like the feedback to my thermal optimization, where I allow my boiler to be heated up to a very high temperature when no one is drawing water. It simply stores the energy, it's a battery in a way. And in the morning when you take a shower, it's enough to draw from it That's basically the whole idea. And when you consider that, there are indeed many medium-sized consumers who have a profile where they can actually start an hour later. And maybe it's even the baker, I don't know. Many of these processes are likely automated and run on a timer. Getting up at 5 in the morning or at 5:45 a.m. probably doesn't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. And if Thorsten is allowed to control it from a distance, it could become interesting.
But that's still an important point. So, larger bakers, not the small bakery that only has one oven, but even there, cooling processes and other factors are relevant. But that is also part of the, shall I say, translation performance that Dynamic Flex offers. That means I actually come from the market or from the perspective of energy providers with a kilowatt hour or megawatt hour lens. That means how much electrical energy is currently being consumed or has been consumed needs to be ramped up, along with many other stories. But it also requires a translation effort. For example, we now need to somehow, or it would be ideal, to consume 100 kilowatts more, or to increase the consumer function by 100 kilowatt. But what does this mean for the cold storage, for example, the cooling unit? Am I even allowed to go that low? Because I can't just cool or heat products to any arbitrary degree, I also have to adhere to certain limits. All these translation services or capabilities are integrated into your Plex. And that is indeed a major challenge, as it requires creating the corresponding transfer performance.
So it's a super exciting development and actually totally expected that this is happening. In the end, it's all about, and I believe this is somewhat overarching, exchanging much more data with each other, essentially sharing information. These are data, and for the emissions data, this is indeed a topic now. With CSRD, that one must actually collect their emissions data for scope 3 throughout the entire supply chain. Stefan, this would be the right time and place to briefly show what Hubert's product actually means. In this context, we also prepared a diagram from Hubert. Would you like to explain it briefly in a few words, because we've already talked a bit too much?
Yes, gladly. Yes, it's actually quite easy to explain. Just as you said, such matters, like the ones we just discussed, as well as all sorts of other processes covered by the CSRD, require many more companies to engage in a very concrete exchange of emissions data with their customers and suppliers. I purchase a product, I want emissions data to be included, I receive a service. I would like to know how many emissions I have caused with that, and so on and so forth. This is simply legally required starting next year for companies in the EU, in Germany, so many of them, and their suppliers will also have to deal with this. And there is a concern that not only we have, but many others as well, that this could really end in utter chaos if, for example, companies are starting to send out emails, which is actually happening, with attached word questionnaires for the emissions data and so on. That is one problem that needs to be mitigated somehow. The other issue is that we have found that the data is often needed by multiple parties. So in a rental building, every tenant, meaning now in a business office building, needs emission data, and those are basically the same, because I am just distributing the data of the building among all the tenants. And we have created a platform that largely helps to automate this. On one hand, it facilitates contact with the suppliers, providing them with assistance to enter their emissions data, like a kind of yellow pages for emissions data. And also mechanisms that allow for multiple uses and sharing, so that I can automatically perform share calculations, thereby significantly reducing the workload and chaos of 2021, making it a controlled and labor-saving process. This is our ESG data exchange platform. As Thorsten has already mentioned, we are proud to be able to help support this system at E.ON Group Innovation GmbH with the right ESG evidence. But this is also the case in many other areas, as many companies are affected by this obligation, and that is also good. At the beginning, we had a location market base, so to speak, to clarify what actual emissions we have, which suppliers cause which emissions, in order to manage that. That is the whole idea behind it. And I can only manage what I can measure and what I can influence. And that is what our platform is built for. You are muted, Matthias.
Exactly. That just happened to me too. Sorry. So that means the platform helps me use and to collect this data. This is especially important, as I already mentioned, for scope 3, meaning all the emissions produced by my supply chain that I need to report. But before one can report their own consumption, one must report on scope 2, and it is becoming more interesting now because it is no longer sufficient to say I have this emission factor and I consumed this many kilowatt hours this month or this year. Rather, everything is becoming much more dynamic. A listener has just asked in the chat how this is being offered now. What level of granularity will we actually get for these location-based emissions data in the future? I believe it's important that we explain this now. And that fits wonderfully because, of course, the collaboration between E.ON Group Innovation GmbH and Hubert comes into play, which we could perhaps discuss briefly. Thorsten, you will probably provide the data in a more granular way. You mentioned this earlier, looking back, what emissions have actually occurred. Is that correct?
Yes, at the moment we are really managing it. So the location granularity is at the postal code level for the year 2001. And regarding the temporal resolution, it is currently a 15-minute grid. This is actually common in the energy industry. This means that based on this, I can plan or rather reporting retroactively, can then aggregate to daily, weekly, and annual figures as needed.
Okay, so that means postal code, which is the first answer regarding geographical granularity, and 15 minutes would be the temporal aspect. This also means that on such a single beautiful day, I receive almost 100 data records from you. You no longer want to manually capture that in some way. Everything needs to flow into a system where it can be processed. Or, Stefan, I think we can say that the platform comes into play here, and there is already a connection. Shall we briefly explain how that works in 2021?
Exactly. So basically, I had described it in general, and now it is such that for each of these 15-minute slots that Thorsten Dahlmann produces, we practically create what we call a transactional ESG proof, which the companies using it can then aggregate in their reports. And so I get, so to speak, in my scope 2 very detailed but highly aggregated time slices with the kilowatt hours specifically made available to me. The energy mix is clearly recognizable. And from this disclosure overview, I can aggregate my scope 2 disclosure and say that last month I simply take the sum of all these, and that is my energy consumption. However, it is also my specific location-based CO mix, which is likely to look better for the reasons that Thorsten has outlined, because it is managed. And that is, by the way, I would like to add briefly, also for the colleague who asked the question, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol allows for this. It is stated that real-time management systems can be used, meaning you are not simply exposed to what is currently happening from the outlet around you, but you can manage it. What Dynamic Flex does is explicitly mentioned in the standard, allowing it to manage its emissions down again, even in the location-based part. And we help ensure that the corresponding evidence is always made available and can then be included in the customer's CSRD report in a reportable and audit-ready manner, or, by the way, in CSRD controlling. I think that we are talking about companies that may monitor their emissions on a monthly basis, not so much for the year-end report, where they also want to look good, but they have a controlling unit that keeps an eye on it all the time and tries to reduce it step by step due to their net zero ambition and strategy.
Is this actually a topic that just came to my mind, where artificial intelligence can also help? This is a topic that we encounter at almost every street corner and somehow get involved in everywhere. But especially when it comes to control and optimization, so to speak, the optimal planning of my energy consumption is there. Can I say it this way? AI in your Dynamic Flex, Thorsten, or will it be available as an add-on at some point?
No, to be honest, it is based on AI, the optimization algorithms, yes.
So that means this is already with AI. That means you already have, so to speak, self-learning, forward-thinking algorithms and machines involved. Yes, exactly. Okay. Yes, we are already quite close to the end, at least in terms of time. One could talk about this for a long time. I'm also a bit curious about how things will progress from here. Can we make some predictions about the future of the energy transition? What developments can we still expect or look forward to from the providers? Can you give us a little teaser? What are you thinking about? What can you reveal, Thorsten?
Yes. So basically, flexibility will accompany us in the coming years, as has already been announced or indicated, with the broad emergence of dynamic tariffs, but also for private customers, other smaller consumers, or municipalities, however it may be. This certainly opens up entirely new possibilities, especially now with the new regulations surrounding the Smart M rollout, which we have been waiting for at least for years. This will unleash completely different dynamics. 2001, that means I can now really do something effective at home and also participate, not just for goodwill, even though that is a good motivation, but at the end of the day, it also has to pay off. Of course, network expansion and smartification will continue to drive us forward. There is no way around it. But the expansion of large storage facilities, in order to truly provide capacities there, would also, I believe, occupy us.
Okay, exciting. Storage is clear, and Smart M essentially brings the next level for your private energy transition. Stefan, when you use the Smart M, everything at home is optimized for the daughters. Now, what's next with the ESG data exchange network? Could you also give a bit of a future outlook? What are the next important topics that you are focusing on?
Yes, of course. So one thing is, as I said, we are quite sure that we are one of the first to offer Scope 2, aggregation, data collection, and the like. It's a bit neglected. You just enter some number from the energy provider. That's it. That will certainly change. We will be at the forefront with our integration and, of course, with our cooperation with E.ON. And in general, we have similar efforts in the logistics sector, where a lot of transactional data is also generated. By the way, I believe it is worth mentioning that the next BirchTalk will be on this topic.
That works well. Yes, let's maybe display that here. You can already sign up. I wanted to do that anyway. Exactly. Next BirchTalk is on Thursday at 11, where we will discuss logistics and how Hubert is finally helping to bring transparency into logistics needs, planning, and execution. It's also a really exciting topic, and we are already looking forward to it. And through this QR code, which we might leave up for a moment, you can also sign up for it. Well, Stefan, you logically said that transactional data will actually become a topic in more and more areas. And I believe it goes without saying that it is incredibly important to have data exchange platforms so that this data does not have to be manually entered or imported and exported through files. Everything will only work if the systems are actually connected directly to each other. The future lies in transparency, in data exchange, in flexibility, and perhaps sometimes also a bit in stepping out of the comfort zone. We have heard all of this today, and we are at the end of 2001. It was incredibly exciting, and I believe there was a lot of interesting information to learn. What does location-based really mean now? Have we understood? And what do we need to do as a conclusion? What offers are there ultimately from the energy providers? I would like to sincerely thank you once again. The time flew by during the flight. This is always a good sign because it means it was engaging and interesting. 2001, I hope it has been the same for our listeners as well. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for your contribution, dear Thorsten. In this photo, I can't recognize you at all, but I believe it's still you. Thank you, Stefan. It was great to have you here, And thanks to our technology team in the background for making everything work so wonderfully, we have also included a QR code for the brand new white paper from uBird on the topic of Scope 2 and energy. So let's briefly mention that anyone who wants to download the newsletter or the white paper can do so at this point. I want to thank both of you. Anyway, thank you out there. Thank you, Stefan.